putting this instruction note without necessarily applying the minds, because really they didn't take much time to apply the minds into putting together this instruction note, and that is why such things are coming up where you're saying now you report into a policy something that's 2,500 and it's a deviation or it's a variation or anything of that nature. So yeah, I think that's my thought. Thanks.
Yeah, there's got to be a bigger discussion that must happen with Treasury on these issues and the way they're going about things. Restriction, debarment. There's also some changes here which have come through. We're spending a little bit of time on this, by the way, because there's big differences between the draft that they issued and what they've issued now in final. Some big differences. The one point that Ron raised about expansions being an other means under deviations, in the draft, it actually had that. It recognized that an expansion was also an other means, and it's completely dropped in this version. So restriction of a person doing business with government, the AOAA must in writing notify a person with the intention to restrict a person from doing business with the state, the grounds for restriction, the intended period of restriction, which may not exceed 10 years, and the right to them to make representation within 14 days as to why the person should not be restricted. So if you have someone that you believe you should restrict, you must tell them that you have the intention of doing that, the basis, the grounds for that restriction, and they must then have the right to come back and make representation to you within 14 days as to why they should not be restricted. Then a very interesting new step that they've included, which we didn't have before, is once you've then received that response from them, you must then consider that. And if you feel that you still want to restrict them, you must then, in writing, consult with Treasury on this restriction. And Treasury must then come back to you within 14 days on their view. 14 days later, so when you get National Treasury's view, 14 days, then you must consider their view, and then within 7 days following the decision to restrict them, you must then notify National Treasury that you are indeed now restricting them, with the reasons, the name, the identity, the period of restriction, and what representation was made by the person who you've decided to now restrict. So you say, we want to restrict. You write to the company concerned. You give them 14 days to respond to you. They come back. If you then feel that you want to continue, you then consult with Treasury. They come back within 14 days. You then decide if you can still want to continue. You make that decision, and then within 7 days, you've got to tell Treasury that you have now decided to restrict them. They will then put onto their restricted list, and may within 40 days request you for more information. So they could then say, hang on a sec, no, 14 days more, and there must be another flow. And then they're going to eventually put that person on the restricted list. Once they've done that, they must then inform you that they have now recorded it immediately after the restriction is recorded. And you must then inform the person immediately that they have now been restricted. Now, these last 2 points weren't in previous instructions at all, nor was it in the draft, if I'm correct. So some interesting little additions. There's no reference to a penalty. In the old instruction, there was a penalty discussion that included. They've now got this additional consultation step, which is there. There's more information you've got to give to Treasury, including the bidder's response. And then there is this immediate couple of steps that happens towards the back end on the restrictions. Any comments from yourselves on this restrictions? By the way, I've just got debarments here, because debarment is the term that is used in the draft public procurement bill. And interesting that they're still not using debarment. And there might be some subtle reasons as to why that is the case. So let's go ahead. We'll go first to Tandiwe, then Ron, then Sanele.
Thanks, Sean. I think for today, I'll declare that I love MFMA. I'm an MFMA person, just for today. My confusion on this one, because one question that came on one of the workshops I was doing, whereby when you go in doing this back and forth with Treasury trying to sort out the restrictions, what then happens if you have a tender in process and this person has actually now responded to the tender? I know with MFMA, you accounting officer can decide to not consider a bid of somebody whom they've had a bad performance with in the past 5 years, even though the person has not yet been restricted. But now on the PFMA space, there's Sean. I'm going back and forth with Treasury. Sean responds to the tender. What do? Do I disqualify them? What then happens? Thanks.
Good one, Ron. And then Sanele.
Sean, just 3 brief comments. We didn't spend time with the consultation because the last time I looked at the registers, there was nothing in them. Nothing, zero, not a single tender, notwithstanding the state of corruption in the country and failure of state capture and, I mean, just a wholesale fraud. Not a single one. Okay. So whatever the process is, National Treasury were, I think, negligent. Secondly, and this is an academic question, is this register linked to the one of tender defaulters per the per POCA, the Prevention of Corruption Act? Because that's all about tender defaulters.
So there's 2 registers. There's the Register of Restricted Bidders, which is updated, and there's the Register of Tender Defaulters,
okay,
which is the one as a result of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, and that's the one that is empty.
Well, when I looked last, both were empty, but that was a few years ago, and hopefully it's changed. But you know, I couldn't see on other registers. I couldn't see a single whatever.
Yeah.
You're saying this does apply to the. It also applies. So does this instruction also apply then to the Register of Tender Defaulters?
This would not. That Register of Tender Defaulters is one which is only added to if the court orders that the names of the details should be included in that Register of Tender Defaulters. And that is through the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act one.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah. I'll just quickly, we'll have a look just now as to whether that restricted list is being updated. But it is updated, Ron, somehow, because it is getting that restricted list is getting into CSD. And there are restrictions that are being included in CSD, whether the director or the company is restricted. So I have seen that in the past. We need to just confirm though on that one. Yes, Sanele, you wanted to say something? Good point, Ron. Hey, Sanele, we can see you. Just unmute. There we are. Go ahead.
Sorry. In fact, I was trying to unmute. For me, I think on this one, this back and forth with National Treasury should have at least been allocated to the provincial treasuries.
Interesting.
Hey. This because yes, because
it's purely National Treasury. There's the provincials are not involved in this at all.
And it's very difficult to get any sort of response from National Treasury, even if a treasury, it's a provincial treasury, because they are. I don't think they are overwhelmed with everything. And the current situation has proven that they are not ready for any sort of disaster that may occur in a procurement space. So I think this should have at least been delegated to the provincial treasuries, also understanding the fact that they are closely linked, or they are closely closely near with the institutions that are
Very true.
dealing with the service providers, and they would have at least have a better chance of assessing the situation and coming up with the conclusion.
Mm,
And maybe those that a national institution can then go to National Treasury and use them as a point of remedial action. I also have a bit of a confusion. If you recall, we had a session where National Treasury was presenting the e-tender portal, the revised e-tender, the enhanced e-tender portal, and they said we will have a chance of rating service providers. And if you analyze that situation or that statement, it tells you that it is a softer approach on restricting service providers, and it is not catered for in this instruction. And should that be practical, how are we going to work with those two documents? Because obviously, once the e-tender portal has been put together and put into practice, they'll probably have that in their instruction notes. And I foresee some sort of confusion, because it will then have to contradict with this one. If you don't use that service provider that has lower ratings or poor ratings, it means that service provider has been restricted, but in a softer way. And the other one that is restricted based on this instruction will be restricted fully. So how are these going to work together? I'm finding a bit of a confusion
big question there. Good question. So Lily, do you know if the draft public procurement bill in the debarment has a role for provincial treasuries? Maybe we don't have to answer that now, but it might be an interesting one to look at and keep a focus on. Tundi is asking the question around what happens with those bidders that the SIU flags up that were involved, for example, in any tender issue. And my understanding is that, Tundi, that there is a requirement of the court, a deliberate statement of the court to say that when they have found somebody guilty, to state deliberately that their name must be included in that database of tender defaulters. And I think that has been one of the reasons why it's been empty, is because the courts have not made that statement and said their name must be recorded, which is why that has been empty. I think there's ever only been 2 people that have been mentioned in there, and that I think was for thanks, Henry, confirming that it is still. Henry, if you can just check the register of restricted bidders, just to confirm that as well.
Yeah, they're there, but there are around about 2 pages of that currently.
Okay, so that one is there. All right, good. Thank you.